Hey, I'm Bacon, and you're using the word agency incorrectly, and narrative, and plot, and story. But today we're really just going to focus on agency, focus-ish. So today I want to discuss the differences between autonomy, authority, and agency, what I'm going to call the three A's with regard to role playing from the perspectives of the GM, the players, and the characters. So we're going to start with autonomy because it's going to be the easiest to get through. All of the definitions from this point forward are going to be paraphrased. I will provide names, but they're all paraphrased. So Dworkin says that autonomy involves both procedural independence, which is the ability to reflect on and endorse one's desires, and substantive independence, which is freedom from external manipulation or oppression. Decky and Ryan say that autonomy is the sense of volition and self-direction in one's actions, rather than being controlled by external forces or pressures. And Christman says autonomy refers to an individual's capacity for self-governance, where one's actions and choices are made free from external coercion and align with their own values and reasoning. I'm going to be reading this, by the way, if you couldn't already tell. So, in terms of role-playing, autonomy is the player's ability to make independent choices about their participation in the game, free from coercion, while maintaining agency in how they engage with the game. And I know I'm using a term that I haven't yet defined. We'll get there. The group and the shared experience. So again, I'll just reread that because I interrupted myself. So in terms of role-playing, autonomy is the player's ability to make independent choices about their participation in the game, free from coercion, while maintaining agency in how they engage with the game, the group, and the shared experience. So this does align with those broader philosophical definitions of autonomy. So there's self-governance involved, which would reference Christman. Players should have control over how they engage with the game, including their level of investment, play style, and decisions about continuing or leaving the group. There is reflection and endorsement, which comes from Dworkin. Players should be able to determine for themselves what they want from the game: storytelling, tactical play, social interaction, and whether the game aligns with their personal goals. And then volition and self-direction, which is Decky and Ryan. Players should feel they are participating because they want to, not because of a social pressure or an expectation or coercion from the GM or other players. The key aspects of autonomy in TTRPGs is control over their participation. Players should be free to decide when and how they engage with the game, including whether to join, continue, or leave. Freedom of interpretation. Players should have the ability to interpret rules, roleplay, and interact with the game world in a way that aligns with their own preferences within the agreed upon framework of the group. That last bit is important. And then players should be able to freely act in setting boundaries, negotiating social contracts, and addressing conflicts within the group. So players are not just passive recipients of the game, but active participants with the right to shape their experiences, both through their characters' actions and in how they engage with the game as a whole. Autonomy. It's the freedom to make independent decisions within one's domain without external control. So how does this apply to the three different categories that I'm going to apply to? It's going to be GMs, non-GM players, and characters. So the GM has autonomy in how they interpret and apply the rules, but their authority can be challenged by player expectation of behavior. Again, I know I'm using a term here I haven't gotten to yet. Again, we'll get there. They are additionally constrained by system mechanics, just as the players and characters are. The non-GM players have autonomy over themselves and their characters' decisions, actions, and personality. Social dynamics, such as railroading or dominant players, can limit this, and so these practices and situations should be reduced or eliminated. And then player characters, Characters don't have autonomy. They are directed by player autonomy and agency and restrained by GM authority as well as the rules. So characters don't have any autonomy whatsoever. Authority, the definitions. Weber says that authority is the legitimate right to exercise power, distinguished from coercion or force by its social acceptance and justification. Arendt says that authority is a form of power that does not rely on persuasion or force, but on recognized legitimacy, particularly in political and educational contexts, which doesn't matter for this, but that's the paraphrase. Foucault says authority is not merely a top-down imposition of power. So he's going to add something now that both Arendt and Weber didn't account for. Maybe it's Weber. I don't know. Apologize if I'm mispronouncing it. So authority is not merely a top-down imposition of power, but operates through social institutions, knowledge production, and disciplinary mechanisms. And then there's just the good old Oxford English Dictionary definition, which is authority is the power or right to give orders, make decisions, and enforce obedience. So what is GM authority? The socially recognized right of the GM to interpret, enforce, and adjudicate game mechanics and narrative elements within the framework of the game, distinguished from coercion by the voluntary participation and acceptance of the players. So this definition aligns with Weber's concept of legitimate authority, as the GM's role is granted power through the consent, which comes from ceding player autonomy from the group. So the authority of the GM is granted by player autonomy. It also connects with Arendt's view, as the GM does not enforce rules through coercion, but through a recognized legitimacy. Additionally, Foucault's perspective is relevant because authority in TTRPGs is not absolute, but operates within systems of shared knowledge, which are the rules, the lore, the mechanics, and player interaction, which autonomy oversees. So, for role-playing games, authority refers to the power to establish and enforce rules, resolve conflicts by decree, and shape the game world on a universal scale. This applies to the GM, as the GM traditionally holds the most authority in a TTRPG, determining the details of the world, adjudicating rules, and frequently describing the consequences of player actions. The non-GM players have authority over their own characters, but they may also have shared authority with practices like co-creation, though in a much less universal manner than the GM. Player characters do not possess authority. I'm not talking about a role that they may have within the shared imagined space, as is frequently the case with domain play. Their ability to affect the world is based on an agreement between the GM's authority and player autonomy and agency, which again we're getting to, and the rules, which are all coercive. In fact, the character doesn't even exist without this coercion. And then finally, agency, which is a bit of a bear to tackle, but I'm going to spare most of the debates and the ancillary definitions, at least ancillary to this topic. So there are philosophical, legal, and psychological definitions of agency, but the relevant definitions are sociological. In sociology, agency refers to the capacity of individuals to make independent choices within a given social structure. It is often discussed in contrast to that social structure, which represents the constraints that shape or limit individual actions. So, paraphrased Giddens, agency is the capacity of individuals to act independently and to make their own free choices. And then structure is, paraphrasing Sewell, the recurrent patterned arrangements which influence or limit the choices and opportunities available to individuals. So in a TTRPG, well, I'll tell you what, before I get there, let me briefly say this. So agency reflects the ability to act according to one's own volition rather than simply being shaped by external forces. This can include personal decision-making, resistance against norms, creative problem-solving, and then structure includes laws, economic systems, cultural traditions, and power hierarchies. So while structure can constrain agency, it also provides the framework within which agency is exercised. In a TTRPG context, agency is the capacity of a participant, the GMs, players, and characters, to pursue their goals meaningfully based on available power and resources. It's not just about making choices, but having the ability to make impactful choices that allow them to achieve their potential within the game. GMs have agency when they have the power and tools to create and facilitate the game world in a way that aligns with their creative vision. If they're bound by strict modules or player autonomy by diminished legitimacy, to the point of constraint, their agency is thereby diminished. A player has agency when they can meaningfully influence the game world, develop their character's story, and act within the system's constraints in a way that fulfills their role-playing or sometimes strategic goals. This requires mechanical tools which are provided by the game, and narrative responsiveness, which is the responsibility of the GM and why they are granted the authority in the first place. A character has agency when they possess the power and resources to shape their own fate within the fiction. If a character is constantly denied choices, for example, through railroading or mind control spells, or there's mechanical uselessness to what they're attempting to do, they lack agency. However, if they have the tools, such as skills, ability scores, GM reaction, player autonomic infusion, that let them navigate the world toward meaningful goals, their agency increases. So I want to mention now the key differences between agency and autonomy. Autonomy is about having control over one's self. Agency is about having the power and resources to make those choices meaningful. A character might be autonomous, able to make the decisions, but lack agency. Their choices don't matter. For example, in a poorly designed RPG, a rogue might have the freedom to pick locks, but if every door is plot locked by the GM, they don't have agency. So, autonomy is the most important to the players. A player's sense of satisfaction often derives from control over their character, the ability to make independent choices without external interference. Too much restriction on player autonomy, excessive railroading, mind control mechanics, or overly rigid systems reduces engagement. Too much player autonomy, where players dictate world events without limits, can lead to a breakdown of shared narrative coherence. Thus, player autonomy is crucial for investment in the game, but it must exist within a framework where the GM's authority allows it and where the game system supports meaningful player agency. Authority is the most important to the GM. The GM's authority sets the scope of player and PC agency. An imbalance in GM authority has the greatest effect on the game's structure. Too much will stifle the players, while too little will create chaos or weaken the game's coherence, both of which are the result of diminished legitimacy as dictated by player autonomy. A healthy balance of GM authority ensures that players and their characters have meaningful agency while maintaining world consistency. And characters only truly have agency, not authority or autonomy. Characters do not have true authority. They can only have perceived authority within the fiction as a king or a ruler of some sort or whatever other authoritative position they occupy within the fiction, but that only matters if the GM and the mechanics allow it to be exercised. PCs do not have true autonomy since they're not real entities, right? Their control is always subject to external forces, that being the players, the GM, and the mechanics. PCs then only have agency. Their ability to act meaningfully depends entirely on whether the player has the tools, power, and opportunity to make an impactful choice on their behalf or as the character. This means that characters exist entirely within the framework of agency. Their ability to act, decide, or have power in the fiction is a function of how much authority the GM exercises in granting them the agency. I said that a little wonkily, but you get the idea. So let's go over the limits. Okay, so here's the interactions between these three A's. So player agency is limited by GM authority. The GM decides the structure of the game: world building, adjudication, rules, interpretation, consequences. If the GM is too restrictive, player autonomy shrinks. You can railroading or excessive narrative control. I think this should have said agency. So if the GM is too restrictive, player agency shrinks with the railroading and excessive narrative control. If the GM is too permissive, then agency increases, but at the risk of reducing coherence. Character agency is limited by both player autonomy and GM authority. A player must be able to make choices for their character to have meaningful agency, and the GM must allow those choices to impact the world. If not, the character agency is meaningless. A character's power in the fiction as a king or a warlord is not real authority. It is only meaningful if agency allows it to be exercised. GM authority is limited by player autonomy. If players reject the GM's authority, which is it can manifest as a disagreement on rulings, refusal to engage, then their autonomy asserts itself against GM control. It delegitimizes GM authority. Many systems codify limitations on GM authority, like Blades in the Dark, with structured consequences, or Fate's player-driven narrative aspects. But in traditional games, GM authority is strongest when players buy into their role. And if in order for GMs to have authority in the first place, players must buy into their role. If players are talking at the table when the GM is trying to adjudicate, if there's a lot of table talk, then this will diminish GM authority, which ends up, as I've previously said, kind of screwing the game up a bit. And then the system mechanics actually limit all three. They limit authority, autonomy, and agency. Though autonomy, only aspects of, right? Anyone can, at any time, people can get up and leave the table. The system's never going to be able to limit that. But the rules do define boundaries that a GM can override, but is expected not to, usually, in order to render that authority as legitimate. Players must also operate within the mechanics, so rolling dice, accepting failure, and then a PC's or a character's agency is entirely system dependent. If the system lacks mechanics for diplomacy, for example, then the character can't be, or their ability to be a ruler or to be a warlord is weakened. So now here I have briefly, this is the definitions of the three A's in brief. So authority is granted by player autonomy, and it is the power to impose rules, rulings, and structure within the game. Authority determines what is valid in play and how events unfold. Autonomy is the capacity to make independent choices, ungoverned by external constraints. Autonomy exists outside the game. Players possess it inherently. And then agency is the ability to meaningfully affect the game world, contingent on both autonomy and authority. Characters have no inherent autonomy or authority. They can only do as much as their players, the GM, and the system allows. And the hierarchy of strength among these three A's is autonomy is the strongest. It exists independent of the game. A player can always walk away. Authority is next, but it only exists if players recognize it. But it exists outside of agency. And then agency is the weakest. It requires some combination of both autonomy and authority to function. I will probably be doing more on this topic. I need to really sit down and organize my notes. Hopefully I've given you enough to sort of turn around and walk away and begin to maybe use the terms more correctly in your description of what's going on in the game. I personally believe that specificity is empowering, and if you've seen any of my other videos, I'm sure that this is something that you could have come to on your own. I like to define things discreetly. I like to ensure that I'm using common words as they're commonly used, but I also endeavor quite strenuously to map them correctly to whatever discussion that we're currently having. So, players have autonomy. GMs are given authority through that player autonomy. And characters only have agency as granted by autonomy and authority. GMs and players have all three. Characters only have agency within the shared imagined space. So thank you so much if you stayed with me for this long. This one took a little bit longer to get together. Whatever, you don't need to know that. Thank you very much. Please do like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care, everyone.